Jason is going to talk to us about a new book that he's written, A Good Provider is One Who Leaves, which is a story that Jason DeParle has written about a relationship he's had for decades with a Filipino family. Jason is a reporter with the New York Times who writes on poverty and immigration. He is here to give the Crown Lecture, which itself is, it seeks to focus on the ethics, some of the big ethical issues that we are facing in society. And migration, immigration, the movement of people is one of the big challenges of our time and raises many ethical questions for us. And so the Crown Lecture brings focus to such important issues, and it's named after Lester Crown, who endowed the lecture series. And we've had Nobel laureates. We've had 3 different Nobel laureates. Nadia Murad was here last year. Before that, we've had Jody Williams and Shirin Ebadi, also Nobel Peace laureates. We've also had Pulitzer Prize-winning authors like Jared Diamond. And so it's very fitting that we have Jason with us today, because not only is Jason, I must say, his highest honor is that he's a Duke alum, of course, but he's also a finalist twice for the Pulitzer Prize and a recipient of the George Polk Award. He was an Emerson Fellow at the New American Foundation, and he's also received an award from our own DeWitt Wallace Center on Media and Democracy, namely the Futrell Award for Outstanding Achievement in Communications and Journalism. And so now he can also add to your CV a distinguished Crown Lecturer. So we're very lucky to have him with us today to talk about immigration and migration. And having that conversation with him is our own Phil Bennett. Phil Bennett is the Eugene C. Patterson Professor of the practice of journalism, and you may also know of his work with Frontline, the public affairs program that he is a special producer for. And before that, he was the managing editor of the Washington Post. So they're going to have a conversation for a bit. Then they're going to open it up for questions. So if you have questions, you can start thinking about those, and we'll try to have a more interactive session at the end. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. And Phil and Jason, I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. So thank you, Dean Kelly. Thank you for all of you for being here. It's a great crowd. And welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
We will talk for about 40 minutes, I think, a little bit less, and then we'll open it up for questions, and we should have plenty of time to do that and extend the conversation. This is a book of many journeys, and one of them is yours. It begins with a journey that you took 32 years ago. You were recently out of this institution, and you ended up in a shanty town of Manila called Levaritza. What were you doing there?
I had a fellowship to spend a year in East Asia, and I was one of the things I'd done at Duke is spend a summer in Calcutta on a service project. I was interested in the poverty in the developing world, and I was taking a sabbatical from daily journalism to try to get a more intimate view and deeper understanding of global poverty.
And so you just happened to go in there. Tell the story a little bit about how you began the relationship that then flowers in this book 30 years later.
After a few months in Manila, I decided I wanted to move in with a family, like a shanty town. About a third of Manila is covered by shanty towns, informal settlements, squatter areas. I called the Philippines' most famous nun, who's a woman named Sister Christine Tan, who lived and worked in a shanty town called Levaritza. She was a friend of the new president, Cory Aquino, and busy on a commission that was drafting the new Philippine constitution. She wasn't eager for my call. She said, "Call me back in a few months." She sort of snapped at me. I was eager to get a quicker audience, so I let her know that I'd been working with another nun in her order, and I discovered they weren't friends. She said, "That's a mistake. Come see me tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock." So got my audience with her. When I arrived, she said, "Are you CIA?" "Well, you wouldn't tell me if you were, would you?" She told me that moving in with a family in Levarisa wouldn't work. Most Americans need toilets. Most families in Levarisa didn't have them. The poor are magnificent people, unlike the rich, she said. They would feel a need to cook me something special. I'd be a burden. And she talked on like that for a while. And finally she said, "You know, we need to do more to build relationships between the first world and the developed. If you come back in a few days, I'll see what I can do." So I thought she would use the time between the two meetings to approach a family discreetly and see if somebody would be willing to take me in as a boarder. Instead, she led me through the squatter area into the alleyways and auctioned me off on the spot. The first family she came to, she said, I knew just enough Tagalog to know she was offering, "Will you take this guy?" And the woman said, "Oh, can't, hindi puede, sister, cannot be, no room." And the second woman was equally aghast, and the third was just struck mute and stood there not knowing what to say. Sister Christine had lost all patience by that point, said, "If you don't want him, pass him on to somebody else. Don't cook him anything special. If he gets sick, too bad." And she walked away. And I was left there with Tita Komodos and talked to her for 2 hours, and she became one of my closest friends for the next 30 years.
And you moved in with her family?
At the end of there's not a lot of entertainment in the squatter camps. We were it. So we drew a crowd. There's, I don't know, 50 people standing around us, and they start shouting questions. Ask him if he eats rice. Ask him if he wants to marry a Filipina. And this goes on for about 2 hours, and Tita's stalling, trying to think of any way to keep me from moving in her house, and eventually decides that Sister Christine's introduction left her no choice but to offer me hospitality, and reluctantly agreed at the end of that that I could move in. And I came back the next day, and she took me to the market to buy a mat and sleep on her floor. And I didn't know if I was going to stay a day, a week. I ended up living there on and off for 8 months and becoming a lifelong friend.
And what was the focus of your interest then? What were you trying to learn from them?
A third of Manila and much of the developing world lives in dire poverty. I was at the Divinity School earlier today, and they asked a question like that. And actually, I think Divinity School languages probably provides the best vocabulary I have for answering that question. I think I was in a process of discernment of what my response should be to the blight of global poverty. I had been a journalist, and I was a little frustrated with the arm's length observational nature of it. I was thinking maybe I should become a doctor or a social worker or a lawyer or some more direct involvement in the lives of poor people. So I wanted to take a time away from the newsroom and get closer to the lives of poor people and to figure out what I was called to do in response. I know that sounds like an odd answer. I mean, that sounds like an odd answer to me, as I look back on it, but I think that's what it was. Yeah.
So at this point, migration really isn't at the front of your mind, but it is at the front of the minds of people living in Levarita.
No, I had no thought of migration at all when I went there. I was thinking about poverty, but migration was how the family survived their poverty. The father of the family, Emmett, was a guest worker in Saudi Arabia. He's a pool cleaner at a Saudi Arabian air base. He would go away on 2-year contracts, and the mom, Tita, was raising their 5 children on the money he sent back. He could make 10 times as much money by doing the exact same work in Saudi Arabia as he could in Manila. So the family was surviving on his remittances, and I thought, great, he's making a terrible sacrifice, but it'll keep his children from having to live that way. And all 5 of them eventually grew up and became overseas workers like their father. So what started as his act of desperation became their way of life. And
among the extended family, it's even greater. So
yeah, Tita's one of 11 siblings. In her generation, 9 of those 11 siblings went abroad or had a spouse who did. And then there's a second generation, the cousins generation of 45 cousins. And I think last count 24 had been abroad. So it's just a large family that it's had all kinds of migration. Everything that can happen to a migrant, good or bad, has happened to somebody in that family. So from a narrative perspective, it was a treasure trove of stories that you could tell.
One of the interesting things you learn, I learned in your book, is that the Philippines, rather than trying to keep people from leaving or discouraging migration, has really turned it into a national mission and has a bureaucracy in place to support it, et cetera.
So I was startled to realize that too. And if Mexicans come to the U.S., they do that. It's an individual's decision. The government doesn't have much to do with it. In the Philippines, the government formed a bureaucracy to recruit people, train them, and market them. So they actually have like a team of salesmen who go around the world selling Filipino contract labor. It's a historically great timing, right? 1972, Ferdinand Marcos, the Philippine dictator, declares martial law. 1973, the oil crisis hits, and within a matter of months, oil prices quadruple. So Saudi Arabia suddenly has more money than ever and no workers, and the Philippines has all these unemployed workers and no jobs, and Marcos needs to get them out of the capital because there's a insurgency brewing. You don't want a lot of idle young men sitting around the capital. So he, in a very savvy way, saw his opportunity and began exporting Filipinos to Saudi Arabia. And then the remittances became a staple of the Philippine economy. It's 10% of the Philippine economy.
Yeah. And so among the Filipinos who leave the country is Rosalie. So she is Tita's daughter, middle daughter, right? And she goes first to Saudi Arabia and then to the Gulf states. Tell us about her and who she is and how she is when you meet her.
When I met her, Rosalie she's a 15-year-old schoolgirl. When I met her, she's now a 48-year-old mother of three, a registered nurse in Houston. If you looked around the squatter area and you tried to pick the kid who had the gumption to get out, like who was going to be, you wouldn't have picked Rosalie. There were, even in her own friend group, there were people who were more outgoing, there were people who were better students. She had B's and C's average, but she had a faith and a resilience that made itself known slowly. When I went back years later and found her high school transcript, what leapt out to me wasn't her grades, it was her attendance. In 4 years of dire poverty and literal revolution in the Philippines, she never missed a day. And she said, looking back, she said, about high school is where I got grit. And she had it, but it wasn't immediately evident. It quietly unfolded in the course of her growth and our friendship.
And what was her experience like in Saudi and she went to Abu Dhabi, right?
She used her father's remittances to make the leap from the slums to nursing school, which was a big leap both academically and financially. And then she went to Saudi Arabia, and I thought, poor Rosalie, she has to go abroad. I thought, oh no, she's repeating the situation of Emmett. For her perspective, it was lucky me, I get to go abroad. That was understanding that really put the story in a different perspective for me. That for Filipinos, the chance to go abroad it's only the most fortunate of the poor who get to do it. So for her, that was a chance at tripling her wage, getting a lot of independence. She did 2 tours in Saudi Arabia, married another Filipino that she met there, and eventually went to Abu Dhabi.
Yeah. So during these years, you're staying in touch with the family. You write
great letter writers.
Yeah, the great letter writers.
Yeah.
And you end up writing a story about Rosalie during her time in the Gulf. And she has this idea of going to the United States eventually. And in 2012, you decide that you want to write a book about the family, and this coincides with a path opening up for her and the family to come to the United States. How did that happen?
Now, I actually decided to write the book while she was still in Abu Dhabi. I thought about the book for several years, but the narrative problem was it was about Filipinos in Abu Dhabi, so it seemed like a really peripheral subject to an American audience. And I finally decided I just was so interested in this family and their journey that I would write it, even though it didn't really have anything to do with American life. And then a month later, she got the job in Texas. So it's the narrative God smiled. She solved my problem. I had just committed to doing the book. And then I flew to Manila and met her, and we came to Texas together. Yeah.
And by that point, really, the context for writing about global migration has evolved, right? So now there are 250 million migrants around the world. You write that, migration is the defining story of the 21st century, and here you have a family that has a lot of its particular reality, but it also shares things in common with other immigrants coming to the United States. How did you think about them?
The moment that I understood how important Rosalie's experience was when I read a literature review of the remittance literature. I mean, it's not a moment of epiphany for most people, but that doesn't change most people's lives. But the finding was that remittances, the sums that migrants send back to their families, are 3 times the world's foreign aid budgets combined. And that was my light bulb moment when I understood how much money migrants were sending back. I understood that this was the world's anti-poverty program. This was, if you think that poor people should do more for themselves, as critics sometimes say, well, migrants do. It took her particular story and made it a global phenomenon for me.
Hovering over this part of the story where your book's divided into sort of there and here being in the United States, and hovering over the here part is the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act signed by President Johnson, which we're all sort of familiar with, but which you point out is perhaps the bill that had the greatest, largest unintended consequences of a major piece of legislation. Talk a little bit about that, what it intended to do and what the long tail of that legislation turned out to be.
Yeah, in 1924, the U.S. passed a restrictive immigration law aimed at Southern and Eastern Europeans, Italians, and Jews to keep them who were considered non-white. And this was a kind of an embarrassment in the American Immigration Code. And in the context of the Civil Rights Movement, John F. Kennedy wrote a book called The Nation of Immigrants, wanted to get rid of this. After he died, Congress passed and Johnson signed this law as a tribute to him. But in signing it, Johnson said, don't worry, this isn't going to increase the number of immigrants, and it's not going to change the demographic composition of the country. And lo and behold, it did both things in ways far beyond his ability to imagine. It set us on path to becoming a majority-minority country, and it returned immigration to near record levels as a share of the population. So it unleashed this demographic revolution that he explicitly said wouldn't happen. And that's the context of which we're still living.
So the family arrives in Texas. Houston is a big part of this story because of its nature. They're in Galveston at first. And I thought that one of the interesting things about it, that we often focus on the difficulties of the journey, but a lot of difficulties and challenges begin for the family, the Villanuevas, when they arrive in Galveston. So maybe you could describe who's in the family first and what that kind of landing feels like.
She came by herself for the first 6 months, and then her husband and 3 kids followed. But Rosalie herself had spent 20 years trying to get to the United States, and had an idealized image of it. She thought she was going to Disneyland. Her literal image of the United States had come from watching Home Alone 2, Macaulay Culkin on Fifth Avenue at Rockefeller Center. So she's in Galveston, which is a kind of decaying blue-collar town that's been hit by a hurricane. A sixth of the population never came back. It's nothing like what she had in mind. She has a hard time understanding American idioms. So when we arrived, the apartment manager said we should go grab lunch at the little hole in the wall down the street. And she looked very alarmed and leaned over to me and said, how are we going to eat in the hole in the wall? The hole in the wall served poor boys. She wanted to know why not poor girls. I mean, she was just lost. Rosalie was lost. And she got very homesick. At one point broke down crying and said that it had all been a terrible mistake and she wished she could go back.
By this point, as you write, your relationship with the family and with her sort of goes beyond the bounds of most journalist-subject relationships. You write that this is not an arm's length treatment, and in fact, you have a kind of amazing access to the intimate details of their lives. You're present, and in some cases, you write that your presence may have influenced the way that events unfolded. how did you think about that? Was that a kind of ethical hazard? How did you think about this? Because ultimately, this is a work of journalism.
You know, I wrote a draft of the book and gave it to a couple friends, and the main comment I got back was, you really need to explain more about your own role in the family. So I thought I explained it to the point of discomfort. Like, I didn't really want to put myself in the book, but I did about as much explaining as I was capable of doing. And several of the reviews have said, he really should have explained more his role with the family. So I guess it was an unusual role that I haven't been able to explain very well. But by the time I started the book, I'd been friends with the family for 20 years, and it didn't start as a journalistic relationship. I didn't find a family and say, I'm going to write a book about immigration, I'm going to go find a family of immigrants, and we'll have this journalistic relationship. They were my friends. It just felt natural to be with them, and I tried to be transparent about that. There were a few things, I don't like to put myself in the narrative, but there were a few things that only made sense if I described. They wouldn't have happened if I wasn't there. There was a scene at the embassy. At one point, Rosalie, after these years of trying to get to the United States, got her visa approved, but she didn't get the visa. It's like hung up in the bureaucracy. She's approved. And her plane's leaving the next day. And so she doesn't get it by like 10 o'clock that morning. She's going to be late to get to Texas. It's going to cost her a lot of money. She could conceivably lose her job. I mean, part of me was thinking, well, as a journalist, that would be interesting. You know, it would actually make a point that for all the talk of open borders, you know, look at all the hurdles she'll have to undergo. As her friend, I didn't want to see her lose her visa. So I was in the embassy that day interviewing one of the Foreign Service officers. And I had this kind of debate, like, should I tell her? Because I thought if I told the Foreign Service, she might do something about it. I finally decided that I would set aside my journalistic instincts to just let things unfold. And I mentioned that she was having this problem, and the Foreign Service officer nicely got up and went and picked up the phone and solved the problem for her. So I want to be clear, I could never have had I had no power to affect the decision. It was just whether or not they would release it that day, and a nudge from me helped do it. But it happened, and I explained it.
Well, it's sort of in the context of her incredible perseverance over many, many years to finally, achieve this goal. There are a lot of, even though I think you've taken pains, and in some conversations with students today, of not trying to hold up the family as kind of representative of like all migrants or all immigrants, or and you said today in response to a student question that they might represent certain things about that experience, but not the overall experience. I was fascinated to read, especially one example I think of in this sense is, you write about how migration both feminized and digitized at the same time. And this was important because women were leaving their children behind. And even though the family were great letter writers, when Skyping, Facebook come up, this becomes a really important part of the migrant story.
So the first generation that went were mostly men. When Rosalie's father, Emmett, went, because the work was largely male. It was in Saudi Arabia, it was construction and road building airports, malls, hospitals. Once the stuff got built, and the malls got built, you needed retail clerks, and you needed nurses, and domestic help became very popular in the Persian Gulf. So in the early 1990s, migration feminized, and one of the issues that produces is that women are leaving their children behind. So there's a lot of anxiety in the Philippines about that. The left behind child is kind of a stock character in Filipino sitcoms, and also the sort of hapless father who can't remember to bring the kid in and out of the rain and can't do the laundry, and all, sort of a sitcom character in Philippine life. There's a lot of social science about the effect on left behind kids, but as that's happening, Facebook evolves, and suddenly mothers abroad have the ability to stay. When Emmett first went abroad, he communicated with video or voice tapes, audio tapes. So it would take two months to exchange. He would record a tape, send it home, and get there a month later. They'd record a tape, send it back. Well, now you could go back and forth instantly. And I won't say that eliminates the pain of separation, but I think it makes it into a different experience.
Well, you talk about people being in two places at once, and with Skype or FaceTime, just keeping this FaceTime on continuously.
Yeah, when Rosalie, during the depth of her homesickness in Galveston, she would just keep the Skype connection open. You can sit in her apartment in Galveston and hear roosters crow 13 time zones away. You know, it's just people would walk by, they'd wave, say hi, or whatever. I mean, just it was like sharing a room across the ocean.
Describe briefly what her work was and what her visa was, because she came because there was a. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I think restrictions that critics of immigration feel threatened by that technology and fear that it is impeding assimilation, because it allows, if you can be in two places at once, you don't have to be fully American. You know, it sort of empowers you to keep your homeland ties alive. I think for Rosalie, it served as a bridge to being American. The fact that she could hear the roosters crow and be in touch with her parents and attenuate her homesickness. That transnationalism is a kind of bugaboo in some of the restrictions literature in a way that I found completely at odds with the way the immigrant experience actually works. It didn't seem to be an impediment at all.
Well, let's stay on that subject because it's so interesting in the book. You have not only Rosalie and her husband Chris, but they have their 3 children who are what ages when they arrive in Galveston?
9, 7, and 5. Yeah.
So 2 girls and then the youngest child's a boy. And one of the interesting kind of tensions that emerges in the book is the concern by the parents about the children becoming too Americanized. And you write that, Rosalie, the person who brought them to America, is very concerned about this Americanization process. And not only that, their own teachers, their American teachers in school, are trying to detain them from becoming too Americanized, which they think of as being less disciplined and,
One interesting thing for the context about it is that when the kids came to join Rosalie, they really hadn't lived together, because most of the time Rosalie was in Abu Dhabi, the kids were in the Philippines. So they're not only learning to live together in a new country, but they're kind of learning to live together as a family to begin with. So you've got that level of awkwardness. Then you've got Rosalie's concerns about American culture, which she found that Americans, in her view, value independence way too much. Like they teach their children to think independently, and who would want that, right? They actually encourage them to go away at 18. She thought that was scandalous. They go off to school somewhere out of town. So she wanted the family and family authority to be central in their lives. But she also wanted them to succeed in their new culture. So it was constantly a paradox, because she wanted them to Americanize, but she was afraid of the Americanization. And at one point, one of the girls got invited to a sleepover, and you would have thought that the family was practicing had proposed a satanic ritual or something. Chris was so aghast at the notion that his child would sleep in an American's home. And absolutely not, never, no, not.
So what is it?
I came to realize slowly that this was an ancient fear. One thing that helped me in understanding that was I had some great conversations with a sociologist named Phil Kasnitz at City College in New York, who said those same conversations that I was hearing in Tagalog and Filipino accents had taken place in Russian accents and Polish accents and Lithuanian accents. That if you go back to turn of the century, 20th century America, the parents were equally worried that their children were going to somehow turn their back on the faith, on the family, on the old country ways.
You write a little bit about the tradition of and academic studies of Straightline assimilation, and those seem entirely upended by the actual experience of the family. Could you just talk about how does that idea about assimilation develop?
I think so. Straightline assimilation was essentially the idea that the more Americanized you get, the more you succeed. That the way to make socioeconomic progress is to learn English, adapt American ways, fit in, and I think there is a fear now that you can do better by not Americanizing, by that adopting some American habits are detrimental, smoking, weight gain, obesity, adopting an American diet. And it plays out in the kids' schooling because the teachers, and I think to some extent the kids, think that the American kids aren't as well behaved. So Americanizing in that sense is a negative thing. You don't want to behave like the American kids. And retaining your ethnic distinctive qualities could be the way to advance rather than suppressing them, which is the old model of assimilation.
And the children are, like all children, very different one from the other. But did you find that they were able to sort of thread the needle of becoming, at home in America while maintaining what they call, Filipino values and that kind of thing? How did you see that happening?
It was a much bigger conflict for the parents than the kids. I don't think the kids really, and I think that's a distinction about contemporary immigration. If you go back and you read about children of immigrants at the 1910s, 1920s, there was a lot of shame about the parents. I mean, Jane Addams even talks about this in her writings, that they were taught by their American teachers to shed their old world ways, and they were embarrassed by their parents' accents and their parents' dress and their parents' food. I don't think Rosalie's, because America is so much more multicultural now, I don't think her kids felt any embarrassment about their parents as immigrants and as Filipinos. They didn't have to make the choice between being one or the other in a way that I think immigrants often did a century ago.
You write this, there's a lot of beautiful writing about the children, I thought in particular, and about the relationship. And Laura is how old through most of this part? She's between
8 and 9, yeah.
And so she's a superstar, right?
Yeah.
And so she's 8 or 9, and you write of her, in coming to Galveston, Laura didn't find the idealized place her mother had imagined, but as some immigrants have always done, she brought it with her. She was what she came to find. I just thought that was really something. How did you see that?
So Laura arrives in a second grade in America, and her teacher hears she's getting a Filipino student, and she thinks, great, fresh off the boat Filipino, she says, because the teacher had gone to high school in Singapore where her best friend was a Filipino, and she imagined, dealing in ethnic stereotypes, that she was going to have a well-behaved, religious, dainty, polite, younger, which is exactly what she got in Laura. And the teacher has the worst class she's had in 10 years of teaching, all kinds of behavioral problems, like kids constantly disrupting the class. So, in fact, one of them, I tried to blend in the second grade class to the extent you can blend in as a 50 or, and one of the students, every time the teacher turned her back, I was sat in the back and took notes on a laptop, and he would turn around and hiss towards me, "Hey, fast typing dude, yo, what's up?" So this is what's going on in the class all day long, and Laura's got her hands folded, and she's got the apple on her desk. So she was at once the most foreign kid, she really was, fresh off the boat Filipino, but she was the Norman Rockwell vision of the dainty girl that second grade teacher had hoped to teach. She was what Laura was, what Rosalie was hoping America would be.
There's still so many complicated emotions.
Laura at one point says, she turned to me, she said, "Why are Americans so bad?"
There are complicated emotions throughout this story, and one of the surprising things that, for me at least, was just reading even deep into the story, Rosalie's guilt, not wanting to disclose to home either success or failure, right? So when she really succeeds and she gets her house in the suburbs and all that, she's very reluctant, and she describes the guilt of feeling that success.
Rosalie's life was never Rosalie's, which is one of the ennobling things about her. I think one reason I was drawn to her story was the depth of sacrifice that she made for her family in terms of the amount of the share of her income that she sent home for decades. The money was a big part of it, but also when she was in Abu Dhabi, her sister was basically raising Christine, and Christine started to call her aunt, Rosalie's sister, Mama, and she really lost her daughter. So one of the sort of subplots of the book is really a wrestling over between Rosalie and her sister over who was going to be. One was Mama and one was Mommy, and it was who's going to have control. So she not only gave her earnings to her family, she gave her own child to her sister, really. And yeah, there was never an easy resolution of that for her. If she showed how much she was succeeding in America, she felt like it would just increase the requests, quicken the demands for more money. You know, she felt ashamed of how much money she was making in America versus how little they had. You know, she wanted her own house, but she felt guilty about having it. Yeah.
For those of you who've read Jason's first book, American Dream, this is about the reform of the welfare system in the 1990s, where the three main characters are all women in Milwaukee. And then one encounters the really strong women characters in this book. You know, they're not just driving the narrative, they seem to be driving history. And I was just so impressed by that it's mother, daughter, sister, really, and granddaughters all are really the protagonists of this book. Is that a coincidence? Were you aware of that?
I was more aware of it in the Milwaukee book, and in that case, it was that I think I had more access to the women. So there's a book about African Americans in the central city. It was harder to get men to talk to me. The women were more open to talking. I don't think the men in this story were averse to talking. I think it was just that Rosalie happened to be the star of the family, the protagonist.
Yeah. So you described earlier today in conversation with students that when you started writing this book, you thought that the kind of framework for it would be that the United States, unlike other countries in Europe and elsewhere, had avoided a backlash against immigration. And so that changes, right? And it changes with the 2016 campaign. How did that change your book? How did that change the way you looked at whether, you know, the either hopefulness or challenges of the process that you were describing? How does that impact the Villanueva family?
Well, it made me glad that I missed my book deadline by several years, because I would have looked really foolish if I had published this book in like 2015 and said we'd never have a backlash in America. Yeah, initially, I mean, I didn't write it, I didn't start with because I had strong feelings about immigration. I had strong feelings about this family and their grace and faith and resilience. I wanted to document that and celebrate that. And initially, I thought the context around it was, why does the United States do a better job at welcoming people like this than Europe? And I had various thoughts about why that might be. And then the whole lens changed, and the national narrative turned against immigration. But I don't think the local, what it did is I had to put two narratives together, because I think the local level of immigration in the United States is still, for the most part, favorable and welcoming. I mean, Houston, where she settles, is deep in red state America, but it's a very welcoming place towards immigrants. And I think that there's a tension between the national narrative and the local level. I think that probably added something to the book.
So you write about, you know, that this entire subject is dominated by contradictions, and the stories are, you know, the story is the contradiction. So how do you reconcile the consistent public opinion polling showing support for the idea of immigration? If Americans are asked, is immigration a good thing? That line just goes up and up, and it's higher today than it was, 10 years ago. And try to reconcile that with the politics of the country.
I had to almost put a sticky note on my computer that said public opinion does not equal politics, because during the 70s, 80s, as the system is expanding, 3 times in the 1980s, Congress expanded immigration. Public opinion was pretty negative about immigration. And then now we get into a restrictionist age where public opinion is pretty positive. So the immigration politics is the product of interest groups and an impassioned minority. It's not a reflection of what the broad majority feels. It's a the broad majority of Americans, I think, are pro-immigrant, but kind of passively and not that worked up over it one way or the other, whereas obviously the internet and other things have given voice to an impassioned anti-immigrant minority.
Okay, so that may be one factor. I mean, you've written in the Times about the origins of the restrictionist movement, John Taunton and the various organizations that he inspired. You've written about your fellow Duke graduate Stephen Miller and the role that he played in articulating and designing the immigration policies of the current administration. What do you think accounts for that backlash, taking hold politically? What factors?
Yeah, there's 5 or 6 things, big structural factors you would look at. One, I think probably the easiest to understand is demographics. So immigration started as a coastal phenomenon in the 70s and 80s. It was mostly in the traditional gateway cities, and then by the 90s and 2000s, it accelerates into the geographic base of the GOP, the South. Number of immigrants in North Carolina is 5 times, 6 times is what it was a couple of decades ago. So that's one factor. I think the rise of the internet and the polarized media gave a lot of people to go around the gatekeepers, gave voice to that. I think 9/11 added a level of security anxiety to the immigration conversation. I think the end of the Cold War weakened American support for refugees. Ronald Reagan, in his acceptance speech at the 1980 convention, gave a talk about Ronald Reagan, about how immigrants are welcoming immigrants as a sign that we enjoy God's blessing in the United States. I mean, can you imagine a Republican president saying that now? But that was in the context of the Cold War, where he was welcoming refugees from from communist countries, and so seeing it as an element of foreign policy. I think there's technological, economic, demographic, global forces at work that have that anti-immigrant faction has always been there. It's allowed it to grow in prominence inside the Republican Party.
You don't really write about immigrants who are in the country without government authorization, who have either entered without a visa or have overstayed their visas or are here in undocumented status. One of the students in the class we were just in, I thought asked a very good question about, did you talk to that about, what does Rosalie think about undocumented immigrants?
Rosalie is pretty apolitical. I don't know that Rosalie has any thoughts, but I do have to say her husband, Chris, has said he has some sympathy for Trump's view that people should come legally and wait their turn and not jump the line, which is slightly ironic that he came with Rosalie's on Rosalie's visa, but I think he also sees them a little bit as economic competition, because he's a blue collar worker in Galveston, and I think he thinks maybe it's unfair for people to come in and take jobs.
I was struck by towards the end of your book about how optimistic you seemed, frankly, in the current moment. You say that you do see a place for principled compromise at the political level on immigration policy and a potential way forward. How would you imagine that occurring?
Well, historically, immigration has not been a partisan issue. There was a pro-immigrant faction in the Democrat and kind of a restrictionist. Labor was sort of restrictionist. The civil rights faction was sort of pro-immigration, and the same in the Republican Party. There was a business wanted labor, and then there was a kind of cultural concern. So it wasn't a Democrat versus Republican issue. The more it becomes that, the more it becomes part of the cultural wars, like guns or abortion. I think the more immigrant rights people have to lose, more it's seen in those absolutist terms. When I do think there's a lot of room for principled compromise over the numbers of immigrants, how we select immigrants. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe in the questions we can have, we may have questions about the cultural elements of it. We are going to turn to questions in a moment. But first I wanted to ask you to read, maybe finish this portion by reading an excerpt from the book and really bringing us where Rosalie, Chris, and the family are at the end of your book. They've bought a remarkable house in Texas City outside of Houston. They're really more settled than they would have almost seemed possible when they first arrived. And you comment on that at the end of the book. So maybe you could read that passage.
The National Academy of Sciences did a report, hundreds of pages long, that looked at the fiscal cost-benefit analysis of immigration, tried to look at its effect on government budgets. And it concluded that somebody actually with Rosalie's level of education, her and her descendants over 75 years would contribute $1 million or something to the, so she was a net gain in cost-benefit terms, which was great, but it wasn't the heart of the issue to me. In standard cost-benefit terms, Rosalie's experience was a triple win, good for her, good for America, and good for her family in the Philippines. But cost-benefit analysis alone doesn't do the story justice. Rosalie's escape from Leverisa is a minor miracle. Migration was her vehicle of salvation. It delivered her from the living conditions of the 19th century. It respected her talent, rewarded her sweat, and enlarged her capacity for giving. It made her life deeper, fuller, and more filled with hope. It's great that migration helped her help others. It's also great that it helped her help herself. That her quest ended in Texas is something for Americans to cheer. It's good for your country to be the place people go to make dreams come true. When I asked Rosalie how the new house compared with the hovel where we met, with the leaks, rats, heat, crowds, and stench, she couldn't find the words. I couldn't either. Oh my God, she told the kids, big difference. Mommy didn't have it like this. Mommy grew up in a shanty. Christine looked up. What's a shanty, Mommy?
Great, thank you. And now we'll open to questions. And if you could just, with the standard, tell us who you are. Stand up if you can, and tell us who you are. And
Hi, my name is Julia. I'm a student from Carborough High School. And in your book, you described how Rosalie settled in a community of native English speakers and non-native English speakers. A major challenge in U.S. hospitals is the language barrier between the hospital staff and patients who may not have English as a native language. So how did not being a native English speaker herself help or hurt Rosalie or influence her relationships with her patients that she treated in the hospitals there?
That's a great question. Yeah, on paper, you would think it's a pretty big problem, right? Because communication is essential in a medical setting, and in fact, there's been studies of all the deaths that come from medical errors that come from miscommunication. And one night, Rosalie had a patient come in complaining of respiratory problems, and his wife tried to explain to Rosalie that he lived near the BP plant, and she thought it was a tree instead of a refinery. So that was probably a good example of a potential for a misunderstanding. That said, it really, by and large, it wasn't. And Rosalie found ways to it made me realize how much communication is nonverbal. That Rosalie communicated caring and empathy, and she was that came across outside of her words, and she's very meticulous with written English, so she would get reports and get things in the chart. So she clearly missed some idioms in her conversations, but I think she more than compensated for it with her devotion to her patients. The best testimonial I got about Rosalie as a nurse, the hospital gave me scrubs and let me follow Rosalie around. My wife is a health policy official. She said I was a walking HIPAA violation, which I probably was. But the best testimonial I got about Rosalie was in the produce aisle of a Walmart, where one of her former patients ran up and grabbed her and said, "Remember me," and just turned to me and started going on about how giving, how caring, how kind. And I have no idea I was a reporter. I was just a guy standing in the produce aisle. So it had a real authenticity to her comments.
Great question, thank you. Other questions?
Hi. Hey, I'm Aiden. I'm a junior studying math and public policy here. And I was wondering, I'd love to hear about how you've been able to thank the Villanueva family after they shared their story for the benefit of other people learning from it, whether that be financial or otherwise. I'm interested in hearing about how their lives have changed and how them doing this for the benefit of all of us getting to read it has also impacted their lives.
I think it's impacted, thank you for the question. I think it's impacted their lives much less than I would have guessed or expected. They almost were, I think they lost track of the fact that I was writing a book. I was just always there, and when I finally published the book, it was almost like they were a little surprised, like, oh, that's what you were doing this whole time. I mean, obviously they knew, but it was more, I think they perceived it more as a friendship than a journalistic endeavor, and I don't think they've read the book. I think they came up to Washington, where I live, for a book event, and they were warmly received and got a little round of applause. So I think they feel like it's kind of affirming and maybe makes them feel slightly important, but I think it's pretty marginal to them, which is counterintuitive, but.
Other questions? Hi.
Hi, my name is Jim McCune. I'm an artist, and most of my current work deals with migration and immigration. And my question to you would be, what is the difference between an immigrant and an expat? So when we go to another country, there is this romantic ideal of an expat moving to the Philippines, say, and when they come here, they are seen as immigrants trying to steal our jobs. Do you think it is based on race, economics? What would be your main difference between categorizing someone as an expat or an immigrant?
I think expat has a class notion. I think it's, you think of an expat as a professional who's sojourning abroad. I think it also has a connotation of temporary, that eventually going to come back. I mean, you wouldn't, if somebody moved to France and took French citizenship, I don't know, you might be, I don't know if expat would be I tend to think of it more as a temporary community living abroad. But you're definitely, if you're asking, like, does immigration, does the experience vary by class? Profoundly. I did a piece in the United Arab Emirates on American college professors teaching at the Emirate University there. So that, I mean, 95% of the labor in the United Arab Emirates, like everything, is foreign labor. The biggest numbers are low-wage, low-skilled workers, taxi drivers, and nannies, and that kind of, but there's a whole professional class of essentially guest workers as well, including American college professors who get paid well and have no taxes. And so I kind of wrote a piece, sort of like you, essentially to make the point that you're making, that this was guest labor too, just albeit of a much more privileged kind.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Zach. I'm a sophomore here studying public policy and history. And I'm wondering, what sort of moral and ethical questions did you consider when deciding to insert yourself into an impoverished Philippine family?
Well, I take it you probably mean what the effect on them. I mean, I guess I thought of it in moral or ethical terms in the sense that I felt like I had a moral or ethical obligation to think about or confront global poverty. So in that sense, I thought I was doing something for a moral or ethical reason. I don't know that I gave a lot of thought to, like, whether it would cause moral or harm to the family. Is that what you're thinking? And, I didn't go there, when I moved in, it was completely open-ended. It wasn't, in fact, I asked Sister Christine, will you give me a job? I wanted to have something to do in the slum, not just to be there. And she said, no, it should come from the people. The people will give you a job. But the people didn't have a job for me, and the people didn't know what to do with me, and I didn't know what to do with the people. I was just kind of, I was there. I was like the guy in residence, and so I had to invent a life for myself. It was kind of like it was more like being an anthropologist. It was just participant observer. But I think I felt so genuinely welcomed quickly by Tita, Rosalie's mother, that I didn't have, it sounds odd, I mean, it was odd, but it felt natural to be there. I felt like the friendship, I felt from the start that the friendship was genuine. So I didn't fear whether I was exploiting them, and I never had the concern that they were trying to exploit me or get money from me. In fact, at one point, Tita, while I was living with her, came up short. Tita worked for this Sister Christine's organization running a co-op store, and her job was bringing in 2,000 eggs a week to distribute to the co-op store. At some point, cash wound up missing, and $100 or something. And it was, I mean, a lot of money for Tita. And it was also a matter of saving face because her predecessor had stolen some money. She was very afraid that she would be accused of theft. And I thought, well, okay, this is a problem we can solve. I'll give you the $100. And she wouldn't take the money from me. So she didn't, maybe that was a face-saving thing on her part too, that she didn't want me to think that she wanted something from me. So we wound up going through this elaborate ruse where I paid her for room and board, where I had to increase my room and board and prepay for a couple of months or something so that she could solve this problem. But a story comes to mind just as sometimes I think people who didn't, looking at the situation from a distance, will ask, were they always trying to get money out of you? And to me, it felt like actually kind of the opposite, that they were reluctant to take money from me.
But you do acknowledge in the book, too, that it would be quite unusual for somebody from Leveritza to present themselves at your parents' condo in Florida and say, hey, can we move in for a while and just see how you live?
I wish we had there's a picture appeared in the New York Times of what I looked like in 1987, with a bushy beard and kind of scraggly guy who shows up on Tita's door. I think she just looked up to said, what next, Lord? Locusts? Like I don't have enough problems with this guy. I mean, we were a very odd couple, yeah. And I think we were each kind of sort of secretly thrilled that we had broken past all those surface differences. At one point, I was out with Tita and a group of the Leveritza, other women in her organization. One night, we went out to dinner outside the shantytown, and we were walking back past a Sheraton that had this beautiful ballroom with white tablecloths and gleaming chandeliers, and the women teased me and said, you could go inside, but we can't. And I think they didn't just mean money. They meant we wouldn't be welcome in an environment like that. And I remember feeling like, just for a fleeting moment, that the joke was kind of on the world, that class was what an artificial construct, and like how I had been somehow able, however briefly, with these women to not feel it as a factor, a deep factor in our relationship. That's probably a little naive. I mean, it was a factor, but there was I think a genuine acceptance of each other that I'm really grateful for.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I'm a sophomore. I'm studying philosophy, hopefully also journalism soon. And I wanted to ask, since this is the Crown Lecture on Ethics, I also wanted to ask a question about ethics. So I think your book has had a lot of impact. Your reporting has had impact. And I think part of that is because you have the platform of the New York Times, which is nationally prominent. And I would say that nationally prominent newspapers have a special role in the sense that they have a certain gravitas. The way they report on issues helps to shape the narrative in the public discourse, not just on immigration, but a lot of issues. So you talked about special interest groups and public opinion being out of line. And I know that you've done some pieces investigating the origins of groups that oppose immigration, who funds these groups and who started them. But I also think that a lot of the reporting about immigration crises or immigration debates doesn't always make clear this context. So I wanted to know whether you think national newspapers particularly, but news, media in general, has an ethical role in interrogating these kind of contexts, highlighting differences between public opinion and special interest groups and where these groups are coming from, who funds them and whatnot, how to incorporate this if you think that's necessary, and if so, how are we going to do that?
I would almost let me say this. If we were in front of a restrictionist group, and I say restrictionist because they don't like the word anti-immigrant. They think you can be pro-immigration, low immigration, so restrictionist. You know, they would say, don't we have an ethical obligation to find out where the ACLU's money is coming from and how big business wants cheap labor and how agriculture might be using immigrants to break unions, and don't we have an ethical obligation to the low-wage worker and to find out whether immigrants are competing for their jobs? And I would say the answer on both sides is yes. I mean, I think we have, that's just, to me, that's just reporting, sure. We have an obligation to report on the political actors on all sides of the issue. There's a little bit of a premise in your story, or in your question, or at least it's been a premise in our running conversation today, that somehow the media is doing a bad job on covering immigration, and that's why this anti-immigration movement has arisen, is because the media isn't somehow. I don't share that. I think the mainstream media has actually done a pretty good job of covering all sides of the question. We were talking about a story that's in the New York Times yesterday about Kurdish families in Nashville who have become Tennessee Titan fans. And, you know, amidst all the stories of political conflict, there's a story of successful integration, immediate successful cultural integration into America. I think the newspapers are filled with both kinds of stories. I mean, there's endless. So I think immigration gets covered from 1,000 different angles. I don't attribute in other words, I don't attribute the rise of the empowerment of the restrictionist movement to negative news media.
Hi, Elliot Mamet. I'm a graduate student in political science. I was wondering to what extent the story you tell in your book is a story about geopolitics, and especially like thinking about U.S.-Philippine relations, histories of colonialism and empire. What are those large historical relationships? How do those play out in the story you tell?
So I didn't realize this until I got, one of my epiphanies, kind of like the Remittances thing, was just how much military involvement in a country will drive migration. If you look at the top 10 source countries of immigration in the United States, I think 8 of them are places where we've been militarily involved. Philippines being one, El Salvador, where Phil worked, Korea, Guatemala. Immigration follows military conflict. It's why it's why multicultural Britain is, it's all people coming from the corners of the empire. So that's a different moral. It changes the moral lens on immigration. They're here because we were there. The reason there's 2 million Filipinos in the United States isn't that they're invading. It's that let's be clear about who invaded who. The United States invaded the Philippines, and that's what set into motion a series of processes that brought. The United States invaded in 1899. The Rockefeller Foundation arrived in 1907 and set up the first nursing schools, and that's why we have Filipino nurses in the United States trained on an American curriculum, because as a project, as an outcome of the colonial project. So yes, so much of the immigration conversation in the U.S. is kind of predicated as the U.S. is here, a passive actor, and people are coming and invading, and rather than situating in a process of globalization that includes military links, trade ties, that promote the movement of people.
Any other questions? I'm sorry.
Thank you very much for the discussion about your book. I think that I would like to ask you about a current event that is happening in the UK involving the death of 39 Vietnamese migrants to the UK. And it was a tragic event. And what do you think as kind of migration policy in order to avoid those tragedy for people who want to search for better lives or better job prospects.
You know, it reminded me of a very similar incident right outside Houston. 5 or 6 years ago, there was a tractor trailer bringing people from Mexico who had gone home on vacation and were coming back, and they were in the back of a truck, scores suffocated. Yeah, are you asking if I have the policy solution? Boy. You know, there are people working to try to regularize, normalize temporary labor migration and have codes of conduct that signatory countries can you know, we regularize trade. There's a global body, the World Trade Organization. There are rules for the movement of goods across borders, that there should be something like that. Maybe it's not quite analogous because of the sovereignty issues. Countries are even more reluctant to surrender sovereignty when it comes to people than to goods, but to have some sort of accepted international process that can govern the temporary movement of labor in order to have fewer of those incidents. I don't know that you'll ever completely be able to eliminate them.
Yeah.
My name is Bill, and I work for a nonprofit in Raleigh. You mentioned the immigration conversation in the United States. And in my mind, that conversation is driven more by emotion than by facts in many cases. And it seems to me that it's driven mostly by what people don't like rather than what they do. So you have on one side, you have someone who would rationally say, I don't like children in cages. And on the other side, someone would say, I don't like open borders. But you don't seem to, I don't anyway, see a forum where people are actually proactively saying, here is what an immigration policy that would be rational yet humane might look like. It's more negative in tone. Are you aware of, can you recommend a forum where people might hear policies that are more productive rather than complaining?
Well, I fear the scenario that you're articulating. I'm not quite as pessimistic yet. I mean, that's what I think. If immigration becomes that kind of absolutist thing, then we're going to be in that very unproductive situation. There is a group in Washington called the National Immigration Forum that has a coalition they call Bibles, Badges, and Business. And it's a center-right pro-immigration coalition of business groups, law enforcement, and evangelicals trying to build support. With one of their sources of support is Utah, the Mormon Church in Utah, which has been generally pro-immigrant. So trying to kind of take it out of the left-right polarizing frame and put it into a different context. So, I think there's more of that happening locally than at the national level. The immigration conversation stinks. You're absolutely right, but I do think it's more productive in some other contexts.
Hi, my name is Fatih. I'm a photojournalist from Nigeria, and I'm currently at the MFA for Documentary Arts. And my thesis is focused on African migration. I know this is a school of public policy, but I'm interested in the storytelling aspect of it. I'm following 5 African migrants as they adjust to the US. So from a journalistic perspective, I'd like to know, is it better to be absorbed in one family and getting an in-depth story, or to have an eclectic array of migrants? So to tell a story from country to country is what I'm trying to do. So I would appreciate your advice.
And where are they from?
Well, Morocco, Egypt, Ghana, Tunisia, and South Africa.
South Africa?
Yes.
They're in the U.S.?
Yes.
In North Carolina?
North Carolina, D.C., and New York, but it's all kinds of migration: educational, economic, leisure, different types.
Are you writing or are you filming? What are you doing?
I'm filming photo and video, and also I'm writing the thesis of my experience exploring as an African also. So it's 3 mediums.
So this is a question I've thought about a lot, and particularly in my first book, which is about welfare reform. I was very worried about finding a sufficiently representative group of families, and so did that mean they had to be racially different? Did they have to come from different cities? Did they have to be doing different kinds of work? Eventually, what I settled on was find a character that you care about and that you can make your audience care about, and do the contextualizing in a different way. You don't have to have 10 characters to provide the context. You can have one character and explain he, she is similar, representative of these things in these ways and a little different in these ways, and you tell that in your voice, tell it through a chapter of non-narrative material. But I think your bigger challenge as a storyteller is to get your audience to care about your core character. So if there's one of those 5 people that really jumps out at you, I would go with them even if you feel like you're sacrificing that some element of representativeness that the others, you bring the others in a subordinate fashion. But if your reader cares about your character, they'll care enough to find out how representative or not they are. And if they don't care, then it doesn't matter if they're representative or not. I mean, you got to make them want to find out about the person you're portraying.
I would add that I think there's still a shortage or a deficit or a lag of stories being narrated by migrants themselves. And this is an area where, say, the arts are ahead of journalism by some distance. And eventually it'll catch up, as it often does. But if you have opportunities to bring those stories right into the lives of the people that you're dealing with, that will be, that'll seem new, that'll be powerful.
You know, I worried a lot that Rosalie, that I didn't have a good character. So, I mean, she was my friend before she was my character. And she's a diffident, not particularly articulate, shy. She's not the person, if you brought in 50 immigrants to interview and you were going to choose one to make your book about, she's not the person I was. So you don't necessarily know who's going to work on the page. In the end, I think her shyness may have worked for her as a character, because I think women in particular may identify with some of her struggles. So the character that works to make your audience find someone for them to feel invested in. It might not be who you initially think.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question. Do we have one more question? Yes?
My name is Craig. I'm a visiting fellow. And I guess I'm interested in the Republicans seem to have been able to articulate, build a wall, build detention centers, concentration camps, change immigration policies, where the Democrats, I don't think, have been able to articulate when you have immigrants approaching the borders, like what is the policy, or what is the approach, or what is the response to the Republican positions. And even like looking at the debates, it's sort of how much time has been spent on what is the policy that will help address these situations. And I guess in your research...
I think you're absolutely right. I don't think the Democrats have done a very effective job in explaining why you should be pro-immigrant. The Republicans are much clearer, much more visceral. At one point I asked a sociologist who was helping me with the project, like, what is the case for immigration besides good food and cheap labor? And he said, well, don't underestimate the value of good food and cheap labor. And it was a funny, self-deprecating line, but I think it also is revealing a little bit, and the kind of class bias. I sort of think it's easier for upper income Americans to see the case for immigration than it is for middle and working class people. And I hope Rosalie's, the scenes of Rosalie as a nurse in the middle of the night saving people's lives will help provide one answer.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Jason DeParle, and thank you all for being here tonight.